Hello, Professor Carruthers and fellow students. I'm going to be giving a very brief overview of the BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the Alt Right movement. With everything that has happened over the last year or so, it is pretty safe to say that just about everyone has heard about the Black Lives Matter movement and or social movements that stand against it, such as the Alt Right movement. The Black Lives Matter movement in itself can be traced around 2012 with the acquittal of George Zimmerman, who murdered Trayvon Martin. As a reaction, the Black Lives Matter movement was launched by three individuals called Alicia Garza, Patricia Kohlers, and Opal Tometi. According to blacklivesmatter.com, their goal per se is the following, and I quote, to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on black communities by the state and vigilantes. The Black Lives Matter movement at this point is way bigger than just a U.S. movement. It's a global movement, and it's worldwide. It's 100% worldwide by all the black communities across the world, and also it also part of it also represents just the minority communities across the world. Now, with everything that has happened, current support amongst the U.S. adults is at 55%, according to a new Pew Research study, as opposed to in June it was at 67%, and those who strongly support it are currently stand at about and I have it right here, currently stand at 29% as opposed to 38% 3 months ago, which is interesting to see. But at the same time, it's not unbelievable considering the amount of things that have gone down and the amount of tension that this movement has caused, rightfully, that this movement has caused in the country. Now, we have on the other hand the alt-right movement, which is basically opposite of the BLM movement. They're a white nationalistic group. It's, for the most part, run by white young men, definitely run by white people, but mostly white young men who stand against and hate things such as multiculturalism, immigration, feminism. They despise political correctness, because according to them, political correctness is oppressing their freedom of speech. But this is a fine line to where they start doing things such as trolling and being disrespectful. And this is not to take sides, but the alt-right movement is notoriously known for their language and the way they express their thoughts. According to Nicole Hemmer, University of Virginia professor, and I quote, "They see political correctness really as the greatest threat to their liberty. Therefore, saying racist and anti-Semitic things are not wrong. If anything, it's them exercising their freedom of speech." Popularity of the alt-right movement has expanded over the years, and there are a few main differences between the alt-right movement and the BLM movement. As it has already been suggested before, the main differences are the following. BLM movement is really worldwide, while the alt-right movement, despite having proof of having its roots within the neo-Nazi movement, for the most part, as of right now, it is a U.S. nationalistic movement. Another difference can be that the alt-right movement, to express their thoughts and to raise awareness and to get their message across, they use social media platforms such as Twitter. Twitter is their main tool, as opposed to the BLM movement, who goes out to the streets, has public manifestations. The alt-right movement kind of stays behind the scenes and just, tweets. They don't really, despite they do have conferences and social gatherings such as the CPAC and whatnot, for the most part, they are not as face-to-face as the BLM movement in itself is. However, there are certain commonalities and overlapping issues or overlapping commonalities between both of these groups. There's one that stands out the most to me, and it's the fact that theoretically, they both argue to fight for democracy. Jason Whitelock, former American sports journalist and former columnist at the Kansas City Star, says, and I quote, "Some people don't understand, but if you go back to the 1860s after the Emancipation Proclamation, the KKK was started, and it was the enforcement arm of the Democratic Party. And what's the enforcement arm of the Democratic Party right now? Black Lives Matter." Both of these groups claim to fight for what they're entitled for, not only from a traditional and humane point of view, or from a democratic point of view, but even from a Christian point of view. And it sounds like a stretch, but in the same way, you can argue that the BLM movement fights for Christian values as to everybody's created equal. Alt-right movement will go as far as saying that them losing their white majority presence within the U.S. is equal to white genocide. Therefore, they're also fighting for Christian values. It's pretty crazy. But those would be the most common points of views from these groups. Later on, we're going to talk more about how they're coming from. In regards to the media coverage regarding both of these groups, it really depended on the news outlet. And it's very interesting because it all really depends on whether the news outlet is more lenient towards, left wing liberals or right wing conservatives. And it was very interesting to see how, when news outlets such as CNN or MSNBC that are more on the liberal side of things, they would address the BLM protests using the words such as public manifestations, social movements, uproars. But on news outlets such as Fox that have a more right-wing crowd per se, they refer to these events as riots, looters, etc. So it really depends on what side of the stick you fall on, and it goes the same way for the alt-right movement. I mean, during the Trump presidency, actually, as explained by the media coverage of Black Lives Matter, attention that BLM got on news outlets decreased dramatically during the Trump administration. Black Lives Matter appeared less than half as frequently on both mediums between 2017 and 2019 as it did from 2014 and 2016. Now, in regards to the alt-right movement, the media coverage that it got, again, really depended on the news outlet that was talking about these events. However, Trump did address the alt-right movement once or twice during his presidency. He did talk about at the CPAC conference in 2021 after he left the office. But even during office, there was one event that happened where white supremacists in Charlottesville, Virginia, had a rally, and Trump talked about this rally, and I quote, he said, "You had a group on one side that was bad, and you had a group on the other side that was also very violent. Not all those people were neo-Nazis, believe me. Not all those people were supremacists by any stretch." So even comments as this caused a lot of uproar in the community because a lot of people said, how can you compare, the alt-right movement to those who were there opposing it? It's not comparable. And a lot of research done as well showed that Google Trends revealed that there was a dramatic increase in searches within the United States for terms such as white nationalism, alt-right, KKK, and such during the Trump presidency. So this is all just to show that it really depends on the time and the place that you find yourself. Whether it's the Trump presidency, whether it's one news outlet or the other news outlet, they both got a significant amount of airtime Now, the way that the terminology was used throughout this airtime or by the president or by these news outlets really just depended on what the broadcaster was or who the speaker was. And that's just that's the general problem in itself of news outlets regarding news, especially regarding social movements. What terminology do we use? Now, in regards to the book that we have been reading, the books that we have been reading, Eric Hoffer and Saul Alinsky, The True Believer, and Rules for Radicals, there are certain things that they talk about that doesn't matter what side of the battle you find yourself on, you will have these things in common because it is just part of our human nature. And the thing behind both of these social movements is that the driving forces behind these movements that unify these movements are depreciation and hatred. If you have enough depreciation and hatred for something and enough people that have that same depreciation and hatred for the same thing that you do, then any social movement is possible. Any social movement is possible. And I quote on page 65 of The True Believer, the strength of a mass movement is proportionate to the vividness and tangibility of its devil. All mass movements depreciate the present by depicting it as a mean to as a mean preliminary to a glorious future. Now, the problem with this is, as Saul Alinsky explains, is that there is no perfect future. There is no political utopia. For there to be good, there has to be evil. For there to be justice, there has to be injustice. For there to be a BLM movement, there has to be an alt right movement, and so on. So, yes, it is in our human nature to identify with a certain cause, but we also have to be able to understand that this is just part of life. As Henry James explains, and Saul Alinsky quotes Henry James in his book on page 14, when he says, "Life of man upon earth is a warfare. Political life must be taken as you find it." And to close off, going back to the alt-right movement and the BLM movement in and of itself, they both had milestones in the year of 2021. The BLM movement was nominated to the Nobel Peace Prize. According to the article Black Lives Matter, a timeline of the movement, says Norwegian MP Peter Ady, in his written nomination for the BLM, said the following: "Awarding the Peace Prize to Black Lives Matter as the strongest global force against racial injustice will send a powerful message that peace is founded on equality, solidarity, and human rights, and that all countries must respect those basic principles." Following this, in April 20 of this year, Derek Chauvin was found guilty on all 3 charges of murder against George Floyd. So as you can already imagine, all of these things built together caused a huge positive uproar, and it was a huge sense of of encouragement within the Black Lives Matter community. And the alt right movement in itself didn't necessarily fall behind with milestones. I don't think many people talk about their milestones because a lot of people don't like to think of movements such as the alt-right movement as to be a positive movement that should be celebrated. But they did have a significant event where in this year Donald Trump was the speaker at the CPAC National Conference. And throughout this national conference, he empathized a lot with the group. He sympathized with the group. He showed the group their support. And he might have never blatantly said that he was, part of the alt-right movement. But, to close off his speech, he said things such as, "With your help, we will take back the White House. We will win the Senate." He said things such as, "Standing before you today, I'm supremely confident that our movement, for our party and for our country, that our brightest days are ahead." Things like that were said in the closing of the speech, let alone throughout the speech. So that also caused a little bit of controversy within news outlets and people throughout the U.S. to see Donald Trump give a speech like that shortly after having to leave office for inciting, the scandal that happened at the U.S. Capitol. So, in conclusion, the BLM movement and the alt right movement are a little bit of opposites, quite a bit of opposites, but going back to what Saul Alinsky said, there's no such thing as political utopia. Political life is what you take it. And once you understand that, yes, you will keep battling for what you believe in, but it's going to become a lot more bearable, and you're going to see it from a lot more mature point of view per se. So that's my presentation, and that's what I had to say about the BLM and the alt-right movement. Thank you very much.